What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode number 218 of the Untamed the Wild Soul podcast. I'm your host, Elizabeth Dialto, and if you are new to the podcast or this is your first Sunday sermon, these are shorter solo episodes, so 10 to 20 minutes, where I do things like oracle readings, share my favorite prayers and poems or excerpts from what I'm reading. They're like wild and untamed gospel, heart ponderings, and delicious morsels of wisdom to spark your own truth, your own power, and your own love, from my wild soul to yours. In these episodes, I explore creative and inspiring ideas, thoughts, and ruminations for you to be nourished and fed by going into your week. As a person who was raised with religion, another inspiration to create these sermons was to provide a Sunday ritual that's more aligned with my current and ever-evolving spirituality and worldviews. That said, all belief systems are welcomed here on the show. My truth, ponderings, and curiosities are simply that, my own. So no matter what your faith is, may you get exactly what you need from listening to this. And may you remember always that everything you've ever needed has always been inside of you. You are made from love, you are love, and you are loved. Since 2010, the month of December has been a month of big decisions and massive change and transition for me. I don't know if it has to do with where Gemini and Sagittarius fall in my astrological chart, the momentum of an impending new year, or what. But now that I practice more surrender and trust in life, am way more accepting of what is, have very little need to control or manipulate anything, and have cultivated deeper patience than I ever thought I was capable of, instead of ripping through my life like a hurricane, these decisions, changes, and transitions that come up for me in the month of December are like a sacred unfolding orchestrated by the divine, working with and through me. So this year, December has been about two things: emotional freedom and coming out of hiding. I'm not going to get into the hiding piece yet. I'll share that with you after the new year. Today, I want to talk about emotional freedom, though. In my heart, to be able to feel love and appreciation in the space that was once occupied by so much anger, resentment, grief, and even hate at times, that is the kind of emotional freedom I'm talking about. And I'll be honest, it's something I didn't truly believe was possible when I was in the process of working through all of it, but I didn't give up. I stayed the course, and now I know it's not only possible, but it feels so good, and it is so useful. And being in the place of having emotional freedom isn't what's just useful, but the entire process to get here was super useful. So here's where I want to start. I consider myself a healer by a very specific definition, one who helps others heal themselves. I am certain I cannot heal anyone else. I have tried and failed miserably, but help others heal themselves, that is something I do professionally and quite well. And healing myself, well, that is a lifelong commitment of mine. Right before I recorded this, I was on Instagram, and I saw a post my friend Kisma made. It was a quote by Peg Fitzgerald that said, "There's no right way to do this." Perfectly appropriate for today's sermon. There are two sayings that sound corny, but I find to be true when it comes to healing. You have to feel it to heal it, and people come into your life for a reason, a season, or a lifetime. In speaking about my healing process from my last relationship, I've been able to see multiple reasons for that relationship which lasted for a very long season, but not a lifetime. The two main things I've talked about are codependency, which if you have any interest in diving deeper into that, you can listen to my interview with Terry Cole from earlier this year. It's episode number 147, and you can find it at untameyourself.com/episode-147, or just search in whatever player it is that you listen to the podcast on. And the second thing has been healing from the trauma of being in an emotionally abusive relationship with a narcissistic person, which have been my chosen words for my experience that have helped me to unpack what happened and move through it and past it. Something I talk about a lot is how we all start as these innocent little beings, untainted by programming or conditioning, totally innocent. And in a lot of ways, relationships start out with that same quality of innocence, depending on where the individuals are in their healing journeys. It can take a little bit of time for their wounds to come out and start interacting with each other. Often in the beginning, it's all hopefulness and vision for what can be. Most people do not enter into relationships intending to do each other harm. We intend to love like we've never loved before, create something we've never experienced before, and we make big promises without knowing whether or not we're going to be able to keep them. And sometimes we bump into the limits of our capacity and we can't. When that happens, it's sad, it's painful, and this is where a lot of harm can be done. And anytime harm is done, there's an opportunity to heal. I've spent the greater part of the last 15 months diligently healing what needs to be healed so that I can open myself back up to love again when I felt ready and have a better experience next time. As well, not drag the same patterns, the same wounds, and risk the potential of having another similar experience. And I've gone through all the phases of this healing. I had to make him wrong, make me wrong, be angry, grieve, feel justified, forgive and let go, and that's something I've had to do over and over again. There are lots of cycles and phases to healing, and the harm we've experienced feels different during each cycle. During my healing, I've also studied the impact of harm in other contexts. So what I want to share in this sermon is that the soul is infinitely and unconditionally loving and resilient. It's the personality that does the harm and endures the harm. So we can forgive at the soul level, our own and others, and we can see why people cause harm and why we cause harm. This is what makes us all human. It's part of our human experience. We all experience harm. We all cause harm, often, most often, unintentionally. But people's history and even their trauma, while it may explain their harmful behavior, does not excuse it. We do not need to condemn people forever based on how they've been. And this is part of the healing process. And the more I heal, the more I experience myself as a different person, the more I'm able to see the progress I've made, how I just don't respond to things the way I used to, how I'm able to experience the same things completely differently, the more I also know that everyone else is capable of that as well. And so allowing people and holding them in the space of that they can heal rather than losing faith or losing belief. And in the same token, navigating this while honoring our own healthy needs and boundaries is one of the greatest and biggest challenging opportunities in healing because there's so many layers and phases. At each juncture, we experience the harm from a different perspective. The more space we get from a thing, the more perspective we can have on it if we're doing our own healing work. So for example, something I realized more recently is I was trying to get to compassion for my ex before I was ready. I had to heal my own pain to the bottom of it before I could get to deep compassion or forgiveness or even appreciation for his truth and his experience. So as we're in the process of healing, one thing that happens is grief and guilt show up in new ways. When we can see where we've been unforgiving and how we've behaved in response to being harmed, and we need all of this, it can be very uncomfortable, very confronting. We might shy away, we might look away, but having the compassion and acceptance for ourselves to look at our own behavior as well is one of the reasons why that saying goes, you have to feel it to heal it. And as I was outlining this sermon, I thought of another rhyme. You have to face it to replace it, with a new perspective, that is, a more empowering one, a higher one that lets you move on and use your past pain to fertilize your future triumph and growth. In episode number 208 of this podcast, the Sunday sermon was on facing the shadows and finding deeper forgiveness. During that episode, I referenced a book I was reading by Andrew Harvey called Hope, about sacred activism. I'm still working my way through the book. For me, it's one of those savorer kind of books where I could take it in chunks and then have to kind of feel through and integrate what I read before I can keep going. So I want to reference it again here. In the book, Harvey wrote, "One of the things life has persuaded me of is that we are all capable of greater destruction and greater heroism than we dare to imagine. I love this, and what it cemented for me is why we must become both our greatest forgivers and encouragers, as well as surround ourselves with those who can forgive us when we transgress and encourage us when we need it. When it comes to the harm we incur, there's two types. The type others do or cause to us or for us, and the type we do or cause to or for ourselves. And one of the ways we harm ourselves is by reliving the harm done to us. What I've realized is that there's an extent to which that reliving and retelling of the stories is what allows us to feel them so that we can feel them, and face them so that we can replace them. Now, since we're individuals, what that looks like in our specific processes might be different. And there's a point where the reliving is no longer useful to healing. It's just deepening or reopening a wound. And that's really something that we have to explore and decipher for ourselves, when it's useful and when it's harmful. So I had someone tell me recently that talking about the experience of healing from my last relationship, in their words, didn't look good for me. What they didn't realize is that how things make me look is not on the list of what drives me to do anything, because others' perceptions of my actions are 100% out of my control. So I stay connected to my wild soul, and I use her as my compass for what is right and best to share and when. Something else Andrew Harvey wrote in his book is this: unconditional love and forgiveness are not only for saints and Buddhists. Until you try, you will never explore your own capacity to love and forgive. And I think that's beautiful. And I think that's what healing is, exploring our own capacity to love and forgive. So the first time I spoke about this book, it was in episode number 208 of the podcast. If you want to check it out, you can just look up episode 208 wherever it is that you listen to the podcast, or you can go to our site at untameyourself.com/episode-208. In that episode, I read a story of a South African woman who had managed to forgive the man who murdered her husband and son. And Harvey references it again in this passage, so I just wanted to give you some context. Here's what he wrote. Let me give you an example from my own experience that shows how I was inspired and changed by the story of the elderly Black woman. Last year, a man who had read my book on Rumi, The Way of Passion, wrote to me and told me that he was serving a 20-year jail sentence for torturing animals. He said he knew that the same horrifying impulses that had led him to such brutality still lived inside him, and he was writing to ask me for my help. I can still remember my sorrow and horror at reading his letter. The torture of children and animals torments me so much that I know I have difficulty taking a balanced view of either subject. But I knew, too, that any disgust I allowed to linger in my own heart toward this man would pervert any words of comfort or encouragement I could offer him. I would have no hope of helping him if I did not aim for the height of unconditional love that the woman in the story spoke from. If she could forgive the man who had murdered her own husband and son, who was I not to try to forgive this man? I prayed for days to be given the strength to respond to him in a way untainted by self-righteousness or revulsion. I had to face three things. An animal torturer existed in me too, as it does in anyone who, however momentarily, enjoys power over the weak or helpless. The man who had done these terrible things had had terrible things done to him. And while the animals he had tortured and killed were dead, he was still alive and in need of understanding and compassion, all the more so now that he was beginning to see and feel the horror of his actions. The combinations of these three perspectives, meditated on for days, finally gave me the strength, peace, and inner balance to write him sincerely, and I hope without any trace of condemnation. I told him frankly how I had felt when I read his letter, and I told him of the journey his honesty had impelled me on. I thanked him for it because if I had not been forced to take it, I would still have been unconsciously separating myself from people who had done the things he had, imagining myself to be superior and incapable of such brutality. I slowed down to read that part because I think it's so powerful, the acknowledgement of how a thing exists within us if it repulses us and if we really, really feel revulsion for it. Back to Harvey. He wrote, he and I wrote to each other several more times, and with each new account of the cruelty and neglect he had undergone as a child and the various criminal institutions he had lived in most of his life, my compassion for him and admiration for his transformation grew. Would I have had the courage to believe I could change after doing what he had done? Would I have had the stamina to unlearn the kind of lacerating self-hatred he had had to endure? I'm not sure. In his last letter to me, he wrote, Thank you above all for making me feel that I have given you something. You will never know what that has meant to me. It has meant everything. It has given me a hope that saves me again and again from drowning in despair. I love this last point, the question he asked about the stamina. What I've learned is stamina for our own healing is different than our stamina for witnessing and holding space for the healing of others. That's why we truly can only heal ourselves. And this also means that sometimes we face the very difficult choice of having to distance ourselves from those we love very much as they heal themselves. And you may or may not agree with me, and that's okay. And context is important, and I'm speaking in generalities here, but this to me feels like the learning of a lifetime. We're all perfect, and we all have stuff to heal from. We've all harmed and been harmed. Most people need to unlearn and relearn a lot about loving themselves and others and how the two intersect. And it's so worth everything we have to go through to become more peaceful, loving, compassionate, joyful beings. And the more of us there are in the world doing this kind of work, the better if we, and by we I mean the big we, as in all of humanity, the better off all of us will be. Blame doesn't heal anything in the long term. Acceptance does that. But blame does help us to work out our anger, grief, sadness, and resentment. It's a phase. The key is to cross the bridge to full acceptance eventually. And the eventually is a big variable that differs for everyone and is promised to no one. Because getting there, though possible, takes work, and not everyone will do the work for one reason or another. And it's not our job, ever, to judge others' processes or experiences, although we do. Our job is to be discerning about how we interact with them. So those were my musings for the day on harm and healing. And to wrap up, I flipped through the Radiance Sutra's 112 Gateways to the Yoga of Wonder and Delight, specifically the translation by Lauren Roche. And I asked for the perfect ending for this sermon. And the sutra I landed on was number 22. Here's what it says. Behind the spine is infinity. Below the perineum, invisible pulsating roots open downward into space. The heart is wide as a spiral galaxy. Steadily consider back, root, heart, and know the living body of vastness that you are. I'll leave you with that, and thank you so much, as always, for listening, for tuning in, for leaving us reviews so that other people can find the podcast, and for sharing this with your friends and family. This was episode number 218. You can find the show notes, which has links to everything I mentioned in this episode, at untameyourself.com/episode-218. As well, if you're listening to this in real time, December 2017, we posted our Wild Soul Movement weekend schedule for 2018 up on the site this week. And if you've been wanting to gather in real life with Wild Soul women or come work with me in some capacity in real life, there's plenty of opportunity for you to do so throughout next year. Here in Malibu, where I live, and also on the schedule so far are Chicago, Ontario, either Toronto or Montreal, Asheville, North Carolina, and New Jersey. So you can visit wildsoulmovement.com/WSM workshops. That's W like wild, S like soul, M like movement workshops. So again, wildsoulmovement.com/WSM workshops. And now is a great time to sign up. Maybe you want to put it on your holiday list, even if it's really far out, because the price of weekend workshops is going up in January. So you can save a couple bucks if you sign up in the month of December here. All right, y'all, thank you so much. And we'll be back next week.